And now, the top 5 excuses that non-disabled people give when parking in our parking spaces. At number 5.
Tough.
Down 1 at 4.
You're all right, mate. You've got a wheelchair.
This week's number 3.
I'm just picking up my children.
Still at number 2.
I'll only be a minute.
And the number 1 excuse is...
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see the sign.
A few weeks ago, I asked viewers to write in with their experiences of the use and abuse of the orange badge. And judging from the response, this is one thing that sends disabled drivers all over the country, up the junction and round the bend.
One day my friend Elsie brought me down to do my shopping. There was a couple on the end of this road who were actually having an argument, so I suppose it wasn't a very good time to knock on the window, but I was brave enough to actually knock. And I said, "Excuse me, please, would you be so kind to move your car out of the disabled parking space because you do not have an orange badge?" He opened the door, flew out the car, and he started to swear. He called me a old witch, a old, you're a miserable twisted old cow, and I just stood there stunned.
Excuse me, mate, that's a disabled parking space you've just parked in.
Yeah, so what?
Many of you have experienced this sort of verbal abuse, and a few of you have even been physically threatened when you have confronted able-bodied people in our spaces. Victor had a very unpleasant encounter.
I came shopping here one day and all the disabled bays were occupied. One was actually occupied by a woman without an orange badge, and when she was approached, she became really abusive and very angry, and she actually ended up pulling out a knife and asking me if I'd like to be even more disabled than I already am.
On occasion, you have got your revenge.
There was this very trendy-looking young man who parked in a disabled bay and was about to waltz off for the evening. So I asked him very politely why he had decided to park in a disabled bay. And he said, "Oh, everyone does it." And I said, "Well, that doesn't actually make it right." And he said, "Oh, get in the real world, lady." So I was struggling out of the car and trying to get across the street when a police car came along, pulled up and said, "Madam, why didn't you park in a disabled bay?" And I said, "Ah, there's a very good reason for that." So I told him the story and said how I was asked to get in the real world. And he said, "Is that right?" I said, "We'll give him some reality. He's just got a ticket."
One of your major gripes is with the supermarkets, when the weekly shop drives you off your trolley.
You know, if your car alarm's going off, they will announce over the tannoy that, you know, the car number. But if you're parked in a disabled bay and you actually go and say, "Look, there's somebody parked in a disabled bay," they're not interested.
They do not police the car parks. They put up nice, expensive signs, say you may be wheel clamped. You're liable to be wheel clamped. We've never seen a wheel clamp here.
We asked the top 3 supermarkets in the UK what they were doing to stop the abuse of disabled parking spaces in their car parks. In one store, Tesco have installed a card-operated barrier system which prevents the abuse of orange badge spaces, and they are running other trials around the country. Sainsbury's are testing a talking disabled car parking space, which notifies the driver when they are in a disabled bay. They also have the barrier system in some stores.
Welcome to Sainsbury's. Your vehicle has entered a space reserved for disabled customers.
Asda have the sensor and the barrier systems on trial in some stores and say they are painting disabled parking spaces more clearly. We asked Adrian Stokes of the Disabled Drivers Motor Club whether supermarkets are doing enough.
The head offices of supermarkets are very good with their policies, and they tell the branches what to do. The branches themselves often don't enforce them. They say they don't want to offend their customers. What they don't want to do is to offend the minority of selfish customers who do park close and don't need to, whereas they're actually deeply offending the 10% of the population who are disabled.
Another big problem is that you have to wait for months to get a disabled space marked outside your house, only to find that everyone else in the road parks there too.
The first weekend it was put in, somebody had parked partly on my bay, which meant that when I got on the bay myself, I was actually very close to his car. 2 days later, when I came home, there was actually 10 guys lying in wait for me, waiting to have a go about my parking too close to their car. The guy whose car it was completely refused to acknowledge the fact that this was actually my disabled bay. He thought he was perfectly entitled to park there anyway, and he actually suggested that if I'd got cancer, that was my own fault.
All in all, it doesn't matter where the disabled parking space is. You've told us it's a fight to park there.
Oh, I'm not exaggerating. Every single time I go out in the car, I come across an instance where someone's parked in a bay where they shouldn't be.
So what is needed to stop this abuse happening?
There are several things that disabled people can do. First of all, they must be absolutely scrupulous themselves not to abuse their orange badge. They mustn't leave it in the car where other members of the family can use it, for example. Secondly, they can write to pub managers, to supermarket managers, to get them to implement or enforce spaces for disabled people. Thirdly, they can make sure that they can write to their local councillors to get the local authorities to be very rigid about the issue of orange badges, to only give them to people who are genuinely disabled. And finally, in cases where there is abuse, then to insist that the police or traffic wardens do something about it.
If you've taken action or are in the process of doing so, then I want to hear from you. So write to me, Mik Scarlet, From the Edge, PO Box 8346, London W12 6DP.